Abraham Lincoln here up on the stage of the museum, on the porch, and I've been asked to talk to you a bit about my time in Illinois, and in particular this little body of water we got right next door to me here. This is the Illinois and Michigan Canal. Now, I know that you call this the land of Lincoln, but you know I was not born here. You know I was born in the state of Kentucky. I spent the first 7-8 years of my life in Kentucky. I spent the next 13 in Indiana. I was 21 years old when we moved to Illinois in the year 1830. Settled there in Macon County, about 10 miles west of the town of Decatur. Spent a year there, then moved on to New Salem, and well, you know the rest of that story. But I should tell you what the state of Illinois was like back in 1830 when I first moved here. There were a total of about 150,000 people living in Illinois. 150,000. There were more people living in the city of New York than the entire state of Illinois in 1830. So we need to grow the state a little bit, don't we? Now, as you likely know, once I left, I got to New Salem, lived in New Salem a few years, 6 years actually. That was when I was first elected to the state legislature. And back then, of course, I'm part of what's called the Whig Party. Remember the Whig Party? Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John Calhoun. And the Whig Party, we're all for internal improvements. It might be what you call infrastructure today. Building things. Building roads, railroads, canals, that sort of thing. And so I need to talk a little bit about what Illinois was like back then. As I mentioned, not too many people here. But for years and years they've been talking about this idea of building a canal. This goes all the way back to the days of Joliet and Marquette. The Indians, the Native Americans, who talked about having a portage, for example, and doing a canal. And when Illinois was set to become a state, this was before I was here. You remember when Illinois became a state, right? 1818. Very easy to remember. 1818. And we got around, well, got to back up just a little bit. Illinois previously had been part of what was called the Northwest Territory. And under the Northwest Ordinance, and remember that's all the land that's north and west of the Ohio River. And when it came time for Indiana to become a state, well, let me tell you this. The Northwest Ordinance specifically said, when you get around to making states out of this territory, the northern boundary of the southern tier of states ought to be the southern tip of Lake Michigan. Now imagine that on a map for a minute. The southern tip of Lake Michigan. When Indiana became a state in 1816, they recognized that wasn't fair. That let Indiana just touch the lake. Didn't give it any shoreline. So they asked Congress if we might move the northern border of Indiana up by 10 miles. That would give Indiana that nice long 45-mile shoreline on Lake Michigan. So when Illinois' turn came 2 years later, in 1818, they were going to give Illinois the same deal, 10 miles. But 10 miles on the Illinois side doesn't translate into nearly so much shoreline. It also leaves the site of, well, Fort Dearborn and the Chicago River outside the state of Illinois. And they said, if we ever build this canal, we ought to have it all in one state for legal and political reasons. So they said, can we move this northern boundary of Illinois up a little bit further? They said, how about 50 miles further? And Congress agreed. That's why the northern border of Illinois is so much further north than that of Indiana. Gave us all that lead mining region out near Toledo, and it gave us the site of, well, a little city which would grow up on the shore of Lake Michigan by the Chicago River. And in the legislative session in 1834-35, we're debating internal improvements, and we finally decided to go ahead and said, see, See, this project's been delayed for years and years. When we got talking about Illinois, people who settled in Illinois have heard about this Erie Canal that made out in New York. The Erie Canal, that connected Lake Erie, Buffalo, with the Hudson River, Albany. And it transformed the state of New York, made it into the Empire State. And after that, other states wanted to have canals too. In Pennsylvania, they started building a canal to go from Philadelphia all the way to Pittsburgh. That's rather difficult. That goes over some mountains. But they figured out how to do that. In Ohio, they built a canal to connect Lake Erie with the Ohio River. Indiana had a canal. And Illinois wanted a canal too. And our canal, of course, as you know, was to connect the Chicago River with the Illinois River. That will connect Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes with the Mississippi River. Greatly enhanced transportation and commerce in Illinois. But as I said, it's been delayed, been discussed for years, delayed for years. We finally decided to go ahead with it. Now, the Erie Canal out in New York, that's 400 miles long. And it took them 7 years to build. Our canal is only going to be 100 miles long. We could probably do it in just a few years, don't you think? You know how construction projects go in Illinois? Anyway, 1836, we finally decided to go ahead. And on July the 4th, 1836, our nation's 60th birthday, we began work on the canal. And then a little problem started, called the Panic of 1837, an economic recession which began out in New York, slowly spread across the whole country. By 1839 or so, we were in some pretty serious trouble. A drastic fall in agricultural prices was particularly damaging to Illinois. We stopped work on most of those big projects. We had chartered 16 railroad companies to build railroad tracks all over the state of Illinois. We had to stop work on all that. We had decided to improve all the rivers for navigation. We had to stop all that work. But we kept going on the canal until July 1st, 1841, when the state of Illinois defaulted on its interest payments. Imagine that. Illinois, a frontier state with 500,000 inhabitants, was deep in debt at a time of severe economic depression. And given my role in promoting all of these grand and expensive projects, I went from being one of the most popular politicians in the General Assembly to one of the least popular. I decided not to seek re-election that time. Well, a few more years passed. Come around to 1845, the financial situation of the state and the nation gradually resolved themselves. We began working on the canal again. Now, of course, it's called what we call a deep, it's not a deep cut canal, it's a shallow cut. It's only 4 to 6 feet deep, 60 feet wide. But we managed to finish it in 1848. Imagine that. We began in 36, finished in 48. Only 12 years. Well, as we say, we know how construction projects go in Illinois. But once it was finished, it transformed everything. This new canal meant, by the way, again, the canal is literally right next to this parking lot right here. This canal meant now you could ship things like gravel and sand and limestone, ship them up to this new city called Chicago. New industries developed. The manufacture of glass, hydraulic cement, zinc, things like that. It meant it transformed commerce in Illinois. It also, you know what? Back in the day, if you wanted to send something from St. Louis to New York City, it took you 40 days overland. With our new canal, you can do it in 12 days. Just transformed the economy. It also transformed passenger traffic. What you can do now, you can get on a packet boat, they call it. See, the canal is only 4 feet deep, maybe 6 feet. You can't have speedboats on it. But you can have packet boats to transport the people. And you can get on a packet boat up in Chicago. You can travel all the way through the canal, the 96 miles to LaSalle, passing right by here. You can switch to a steamboat at LaSalle, and you can go to St. Louis. All in 3 days or less.
That's a good one.
And only for $9. How's that for a bargain? Transformed agriculture in Illinois. From subsistence farming to profitable market-based agriculture. It connected the whole country. Now we got what we call the East and the Northwest. That's our part of the country, right? The Northwest and the South are all connected by waterways. It facilitated the movement of people, of goods, of ideas. You know what? A lot of the people who went out west to California during the gold rush traveled part of their route on the I&M Canal. They went right by here on their way to California. Of course, the canal was also the means by which the great cholera epidemic reached Chicago in 1849. But we've got to take the bad with the good, don't we? By the way, speaking of that little city called Chicago, began to build and grow in the 1840s. In 1847, we had our first national convention ever held in Chicago, the Rivers and Harbors Convention. First convention I ever attended in Chicago. I hear they've had a few more since then. Very next year, Joseph DeDille founded a newspaper called the Chicago Tribune. Cyrus McCormick started a little factory for the manufacture of reapers. The next year, the Chicago Board of Trade was organized. By the end of the 1840s, Chicago was really beginning to grow. And the state of Illinois has grown too. We've gone now to being like the 11th largest state in the entire country. Growing pretty rapidly. The city of Chicago is growing. A lot of things happening. I should mention this also. In 1848, when the canal was opened on April the 10th, I was in Congress that year. And a couple of months later, I gave a speech in Congress. You see, 1848 is an election year. Presidential election year. Things get a little interesting in election year, don't they? And in the Congress, we're debating internal improvements. In particular, whether the federal government should undertake these projects, should pay for these projects. And the Whig Party, my party, we're all for the federal government assuming the cost of some of these projects. But the other party, the Democratic Party, they're not for that. They don't want the federal government involved. And the Democrats, of course, as you know, are the party of small government. In any event, so we have this little argument in Congress, and among the Democrats' arguments against federal funding of these projects was, they said that it would overwhelm the Treasury. Well, of course it would if you do all the projects that every congressman wanted, but you just have to be discerning, right? You just pick a few of them. We can rely on Congress to use discernment, right? Well, they also said the benefits would just be local, like only the state would benefit. And I pointed out how our canal, the Illinois and Michigan Canal, had been opened up just a couple months before. One of the first boats to go through that canal was a boat carrying sugar from Louisiana, and it went all the way to Buffalo, New York. Now I said, who benefited? Did the people of Illinois benefit? They certainly did. The people working the canal, for example, but the people in Louisiana benefited too. That planter could sell his sugar more cheaply, and the people in Buffalo, New York benefited. I said it benefits a lot of people, not just the state of Illinois. And then I said this also. They pointed out that they said the states could pay for these projects through tonnage duty. Tonnage duty is the idea when you ship something through a canal, you got to pay a certain amount per ton to move it. And I objected to this argument. I said, how can we make any new, entirely new project through tonnage duty? How to build a canal or clear a greatly obstructed river? The idea that we could involves the same absurdity of the Irish bull about the new boots. I shall never get them on, says Patrick, till I wear them a day or two and stretch them a little. I said, we shall never make a canal by tonnage duties till it's already been made a while, so the tonnage can get into it. Well, in any event, canal was finished, started to transform the state of Illinois. Illinois is growing. But you know what? Mentioning the Irish immigrants were, a lot of immigrants built our canal, right? And it was difficult work. It was hard work. It was dangerous work. And some of the immigrants lost their lives building the canal. Thinking especially of the Irish. Some men were killed, some men were injured. And as a result, there were a lot of claims against the state of Illinois because of it. And I was appointed by a commission to investigate these claims. I was part of a 3-man commission to investigate these claims. I came back up here and I traveled the canal again. I forgot to mention to you, in 1848 on my way home from Congress, I came right down the canal. I passed right by here in 1848 on my way to Springfield. 1852, when I'm part of this commission, I started in LaSalle, and we came up the canal. I passed right by here again in 1852. We visited all the canal towns along the way, interviewed people, prepared reports, submitted it to Congress, not to Congress, to the General Assembly. Now, of course, the canal also contributed to the growth of towns along the river. You got LaSalle, right? You got Utica. You got Ottawa. You got towns like Seneca, Marseilles, and Morris, and Tanahan, and Joliet, Lamont, Lockport, all the way up to that big one called Chicago. I should mention this also. After that, the canal's going along pretty well. Of course, we also built the railroads, and eventually most of the passenger traffic switched over to the railroad. So they only used the canal for about 5 years for passenger traffic. Many, many years after that, even beyond my time, I understand, now was used for commercial goods, right? Especially large items, lumber, grain, and things like that. Now, years later, of course, you know what happens in this country during the 1850s. The argument about slavery, the death of the Whig Party, the birth of the new Republican Party, arguments get more and more intense. Move all the way up to 1860, I'm elected president. And after I'm elected president, of course, some of the states start seceding from the Union. I become president, Civil War begins. But even as president, I did not forget about the Illinois and Michigan Canal. You know, in my very first annual message to Congress, I pointed out how we could no longer use the Mississippi River south of Cairo because it was held by the Confederates. And I said, in order to move men, soldiers, in order to move material, we need to improve our waterways in the north. And I suggested that Congress fund an improvement to the Illinois and Michigan Canal. That we make it wider, that we make it deeper, so steamships can go through it. We can use that to transport troops, so large warships can go through it. Congress didn't buy it, so I tried again in 62. They didn't buy it then either. But I understand that many years later, after my time, you did get around to building, well, instead of making this canal larger, you just built another canal. It's called the Ship and Sanitary Canal. Right? So that was kind of fulfilling my vision. I should point this out too. I understand that some of the tugboats that used to work the canal were actually named for me. I got it written down here. Out at Morris, you had a ship called the A. Lincoln. Had another a ship called the Rail Splitter. And out of Joliet, you had a ship called the Old Abe. Now, I mentioned back in 1830 when I first got to Illinois, only 150,000 people lived here. We were the 5th smallest of the 24 states. By 1860, when I was elected president, 30 years later, we had grown to 1.7 million people. We were now the 4th largest of the states. We were only smaller than New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. We had gone from the 5th smallest of the states to the 4th largest in 30 years. Totally transformed. And largely due to things such as the Illinois and Michigan Canal, right here, and the other infrastructure we built, the railroads, the roads, the bridges, improving the rivers, all that. Like I said, internal improvements, what you might call infrastructure today. Well, there's a lot more to tell you about, but I think I'm going to stop here, give you the opportunity to ask me some questions. Might have a question about my involvement with the canal over the years. Might have a question about my other time here in Illinois, my 31 years in Illinois. Might have a question about my years back in Indiana or Kentucky, or my years as president. But we can't go past, you need to know, can't go past April 14th, 1865, 10:15 p.m. No questions after that. No questions about your current politics. Not able to answer those. All right, who might have a question for me? Why did I not marry Ann Rutledge? Well, there's a pretty easy answer to that. She died. Here's the story of Ann Rutledge, all right? I got to New Salem, and the tavern owner is Mr. Rutledge. He's got some children, including young Ann, and Ann's working in the tavern. Now, I am very uncomfortable around the young ladies. the unmarried young lady. I have no problem with married women. I got lots of married women who are friends, but it's the unmarried ones that I'm just so nervous about. And Ann Rutledge, she was engaged to another man. She was safe. I had no problem becoming friendly with Ann Rutledge. And we found we had a lot of things in common. We both loved poetry. We quote Byron back and forth to each other. She was engaged to this fellow by the name of McNamara, John McNamara. He had gone back east to New York to take care of some family business, he said, but he'd come back for her. Last thing he said to her before he left was, by the name, the name's not McNamara, it's actually McNeil, but we'll straighten that out later. Well, he'd been gone a while, and the letters are getting less frequent, less passionate. She began to wonder about this fellow. Meanwhile, we're becoming a bit more friendly. So I suggested to her she send a letter to him, asking him, what's up, are we still engaged? And if you don't hear back in 6 months, I said, consider yourself free of that engagement. We can begin to record if we wish to. Before those 6 months were up, Ann was dead. That's really all the story there is of Ann Rutledge. In 1860, this new Republican Party, everyone assumed that Governor William Seward, actually he was Senator Seward at the time from New York, would be our nominee. And if for some reason it's not Seward, you got Salmon Chase of Ohio, you got Edward Bates of Missouri, you got Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania, you got other gentlemen. And I'm down here somewhere, kind of out of sight. But my friends in Illinois, my friends in McLean County in particular, Mr. Davis, Mr. Fell, for example, they had this idea. See, the convention was supposed to be held in Ohio. And they thought, if we could get the convention moved to Illinois, it might help my chances. Not that my chances are very good, but anyway, it might. So I went to talk to the state chairman of the Republican Committee, Norman Judd. He went out to New York City. He made the case. Ohio was not an appropriate location for the Republican National Convention because it was Salmon Chase's home state. He said, you need a neutral location. How about Illinois? And the committee agreed, which tells you nobody was thinking about me as a viable candidate. Chicago built this grand wooden structure called the Wigwam. Held 10,000 people comfortable. Largest auditorium in the country. And that was the site of our convention. Now, you need to know that.
She's cut off.
Some of my friends, the same friends who got the convention moved to Illinois, they had this idea. They thought that something underhanded must have taken place for so many of Seward's supporters who got the best seats in the convention hall. And they thought two could play this game. And for the last day of the convention, the day of the balloting, they had 300 duplicate tickets printed up, gave them out to some Illinois boys, told them to show up early, make some noise for old Abe. Meanwhile, the Seward contingent took their time marching behind a brass band through the streets of Chicago. They show up at the convention hall, they find their seats taken by the Illinois boys. They were still allowed in. It did not change who could vote, but it did change the atmosphere inside the convention hall. Now, I know this sort of thing doesn't normally happen in Chicago, duplicate tickets. But anyway, that's what they say. I wasn't there, by the way, I was in Springfield. Candidates didn't attend the conventions back then. More importantly, I was nicely positioned as a moderate. The other candidates tended toward one extreme or the other. Seward and Chase toward the radical side, Bates toward the conservative side. I'm right in the middle. And we felt if the supporters of those gentlemen couldn't get their man, they'd move to the middle where I was just waiting for them. In addition, given my lifelong habit of always striving to make friends and avoid making enemies, I did not have sworn enemies like many of the others had. And in the end, I was nominated on the third ballot with Hannibal Hamlin of Maine and November. Good question. Another question. Want to know, after my first debate with Douglas over in Ottawa, what route did I take, heading west towards Freeport, and where might I spend? Tell me, sir, can you tell me exactly where you spent the night every day of your life? 150 years later? I'm sorry, I just don't remember the details. So I'm going to have to leave that up to you to decide where I stayed. Relationship with who?
That's great.
Secretary of State Seward. At the beginning, he was kind of upset that he was not the nominee. He didn't even, and I wanted, remember who I wanted in my cabinet? I want Seward and Chase and Bates and Cameron and others of my rivals for the nomination, right? I want them in my cabinet to help me. They're not going to agree on a lot of stuff. They're going to disagree on a lot. It's going to be very inharmonious. But I thought that was the best thing, to have them in my cabinet to help me. I want to have other people around me to tell me, to give me advice. I don't want to just surround myself with people who tell me what I want to hear. I mean, how is that effective leadership? I want to hear different ideas, compare ideas, come up with the best solution together. Might be a compromise solution. And some of my men I wanted in my cabinet, they didn't want the others in the cabinet. They would say, I'm not serving in your cabinet if this gentleman's in the cabinet. It took me a while to get them all in there. But then I got them all in. Seward, my Secretary of State, Chase, my Secretary of Treasury, Bates, my Attorney General, Cameron, Secretary of War, etc. Got them all in there. You might call it a team of rivals. But in any event, at the beginning, Seward thinks that he's the one in charge. He thinks I'll just be a figurehead president, and he'll be like the prime minister. He eventually learned. I recall later he was quoted as saying, the president is the best of us. And in the end, he became a very good friend of mine, Secretary Seward. In fact, going to the very end of the war, Secretary Seward, he was involved in a carriage accident when I was down at Richmond. And I hurried back to Washington to see him. And then a few days after that's when I went to the theater. And I understand that Secretary Seward, when he found out that when he discovered that I had not come to see him yet, because he was also attacked, he kind of knew that something must have happened to me. Anyway, we became very good friends, Seward and I did.
So high I'm hypnotized. What's up is down, what's left is right. Chasing stars and holding you. I can't see the end, but we'll see it through.